had been 275 days since Hillary Clinton held a formal news conference. She has just landed in Illinois aboard her new campaign plane, and she has finally taken questions from media members traveling with her today. This is a tape feed of that reporter gaggle. Let's listen up.
Messages that people around the world are taking from that. So the fact that our intelligence services are now viewing Russian activity as a potential threat against our electoral system raises further questions about Trump, and I think those are questions the American people should be asking and answering.
Madam Secretary, the FBI report cited several instances, more than 9, where you could not recall key facts about the classification system, about how you were trained when you went in, about what you did when you left office on archiving. Does that, to critics, indicate a casual attitude towards classification and towards the way secrets were kept and protected when you were Secretary of State?
No, not at all, Andrea. You know, I went into the State Department understanding classification. I'd been on the Senate Armed Services Committee for years before I was Secretary of State. I take classification seriously. The fact I couldn't remember certain meetings, whether or not they had occurred, doesn't in any way affect the commitment that I had and still have to the treatment of classified material.
How do we go in the back to Jennifer?
Would you consider this cyber espionage or cyber war, Russian actions? And if you were president, would you meet with Putin? And to follow up on Andrea's question, your aides used a method called clean sheet to get rid of your emails 23 days after the New York Times reported that you had a private email server. Why did they do that? And does that contribute to people's suspicions about your email server?
I don't know anything about that. That was not something that I was aware of, and I think that the facts point out that there was no connection. It wasn't something that, as far as I understand, that was related. With respect to the first question, I am not comfortable using the word war. I don't want to use that. I think that's the kind of loose talk that we have had too much of in this campaign. I do view it as a threat from an adversarial foreign power. And I believe that Putin and the team around him certainly believe that there is some benefit to them for doing this. As Tim Kaine said yesterday, this is like Watergate, only now in cyber time. You know, breaking into the Democratic National Committee, either physically or into electronic files, to withdraw information to be used for political purposes. It is stunning that we are facing this, and especially from a foreign power that has the capacity, which the consensus is they have used, to extract information and to enable that information to be made public. This goes into, as I was saying to Ken earlier, into the broader discussion about cyber. We had some very tough conversations about cyber when I was Secretary of State. I know those conversations have continued. I know that the President raises them in every meeting that he has. I think it's fair to say that, as we saw from both Democratic and Republican presidents during the Cold War, we do keep talking to our adversaries. When I was Secretary of State, we negotiated a new treaty to reduce nuclear weapons and introduced the most invasive surveillance system we've ever had with respect to the Russians. So I think we have to continue to look for ways that we can work with Putin, but to make it very clear to him that we are not going to tolerate the kinds of behavior that Russian intelligence has engaged in and that my opponent has applauded.
Secretary, I'm going to go to Dan right here.
Hey, Dan.
Vice President Mike
it's been a goal of President Obama from the very beginning of his administration, and it should remain the goal of the next president. Guantanamo Bay, as I think we all recognize, became a symbol of a lot of the problems that were started under the Bush administration and which have not served us well in terms of relations around the world. So I would like to see it closed. There are, as you know, legislative blockade problems with that, but we should keep trying to close it. What?
How do you get through that?
Well, let's wait and see what the president's able to accomplish before I discuss it. Hi.
Just a little about the Russia issue. Are you saying that they're trying to help elect Donald Trump president? And my second question was, do you have any reaction to reports that the Trump Foundation was fined by the IRS for making a political donation to Bondi when she had a role in the Trump University?
Yeah, the first question is about the Russians, and do I think they're trying to help Trump?
Are they trying to help him?
Are they, right? I often quote a great saying that I learned from living in Arkansas a lot of years. If you find a turtle on a fence post, it didn't get there by accident. I think it's quite intriguing that this activity has happened around the time Trump became the nominee. And look, he very early on allied himself with Putin's policies. I mean, to pull out of NATO, for goodness sakes, right? And he furthermore has praised Putin. He seems to have this bizarre attraction to dictators, including Putin. He won't tell us where he owes $650 million. There's a lot of rumors about that. And he has, made it clear that he doesn't particularly care whether Putin and the intelligence services attack American institutions. So, get some water.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks. Excuse me. I'll be right back.
Well, that was Hillary Clinton, her press conference there aboard her new campaign plane, interrupted by a coughing fit, the second coughing fit that she's had today. This press conference, the first in 275 days, brought to you by virtue of the fact that she does have a new campaign plane on which the embedded reporters who have been covering her for the better part of 2 years now have access to her, and she accommodated that by coming back to their section of the plane and answering some substantive questions. We'll have more of that and more on that with the panel later in this program. Labor Day, of course, is the unofficial start of the presidential campaign season, and so it is fitting that both nominees were hard at work today trying to gain support in a blue-collar state that both campaigns feel is absolutely crucial to victory. Hillary Clinton was in Ohio early today. Correspondent Peter Ducey is with the Trump team in Canfield, Ohio, where he spoke with the Republican candidate.
The big draw at the biggest county fair in Ohio, Donald Trump and Mike Pence.
I think it's incredible. I mean, they've never seen one like this, so it's pretty good.
Walking past classic carnival rides and vendors selling corn dogs and funnel cakes, the businessman and the governor made their way to the Mahoning County GOP booth, where local officials have been working to spread the word to the 260,000 people who have visited this fair so far this week.
Here in Ohio, what is going to be the biggest challenge here in other swing states for you?
We're up 3 or 4 points in Ohio. It just came out, so you see the crowds. I love Ohio. We're going to bring jobs back, Peter.
The economy was the big focus here in Canfield and in Cleveland this morning, where Trump blamed problems in the country on President Obama, but problems in this swing state on local leaders.
I think it's just a great place, and it's been abused like every state. It's not like Ohio. It's every state has been abused by incompetent leadership, especially as it comes to jobs.
Immigration is Trump's other signature issue, and he's seeking to clarify his position about what he wants to do with illegal immigrants who are criminals.
I'm not ruling out anything. No, I'm not getting a pathway to legal status. No, to become
a citizen, you're going to have to go out and come back in. Through the process, you're going to have to get online. But this isn't touchback. This is you have to go out and you have to get online, you have to come back in.
The Buckeye State is unique because campaign manager Kellyanne Conway sees Trump getting a lot of support here from Democrats.
We know that there are many crossover voters for Mr. Trump, particularly in the primaries. You saw, I think Pennsylvania was a great example of that, Kevin, where a number of Democratic and independent voters crossed over to support him in the Republican primary.
Another way to reach Democrats and independents, 3 debates with Hillary Clinton. And today, Trump told us how he's getting ready for his first ever one-on-one debate.
Yeah, I think I'm preparing somewhat like I prepared for the other debates. I think I'm preparing. I enjoyed the debating process. I did well in the debates, according to the polls.
A sign that Ohio is critical for the Trump team is that the nominee and the running mate were together at all stops all day, which is rare.
Somebody said he's the exact opposite of Trump, and I said that's a good thing. Because we don't need 2 of them, believe me.
And before leaving the state, Pence gave us his version of the Republicans' closing argument.
The American people know that we can do better than a 1% economy. I think they know that Donald Trump has a vision to get this economy moving again with lower taxes, less regulation, repealing Obamacare, smarter and tougher trade deals. You see this enormous crowd that's coming out because Donald Trump is going to make America great again.
Trump, of course, also talks a lot about building a wall, and here in Canfield, Ohio, his supporters actually built one, but they didn't make Mexico pay for it, instead asking fairgoers to pay $5 for a brick with their name on it, money that'll go to help Republicans in local races in Ohio get elected. Doug?
Peter Ducey in Canfield, Ohio tonight. Thank you, Peter. President Obama is in the capital city of Laos tonight. He is resting after his last major Asian-Pacific summit failed to produce the kind of breakthrough legacy moment that he had hoped for. Correspondent Kevin Corrick reports tonight from Laos.
The complicated challenges of the 21st century cannot be met without coordinated and collective action.
Sounding increasingly like a man with just a few months left on the job, President Obama used his 10th and final summation at the G20 summit to reflect on nearly 8 years of addressing global challenges on the world stage. But what began in 2009 with the desperate cooperative effort to contain the world financial crisis, by 2016 had given way to a host of pressing diplomatic fissures, from differences over maritime and cybersecurity to conflicting strategies in the fight against ISIS, and the bloody civil war in Syria, which many here fear has devolved into a de facto proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, the latter of which was the subject of an intense 90-minute meeting between Mr. Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines here at the summit. The gathering was supposed to induce a blunt exchange about the Kremlin's incursion into Ukraine, sanctions against Moscow, and a pathway forward in Syria, a conversation that took on a new sense of urgency in the wake of the day's deadly attacks on Tartus that killed more than 30 people. Though it was abundantly clear from the president's readout afterwards, he failed to persuade Putin to do much of anything.
Given the gaps of trust that exist, that's a tough negotiation, and we haven't yet closed the gaps in a way where we think it would actually work.
Perhaps even more troubling was the president's inability to fully smooth over tensions with Turkey, a critical NATO ally, but recently at odds with Washington for ramping up its fight against U.S.-backed Kurdish forces in Syria, and its insistence that the U.S. hand over a Turkish cleric that Ankara has blamed for this summer's failed coup attempt. This, as Washington officials privately lamented the vexing variety of diplomatic and strategic masks worn by the Chinese, with Beijing, on the one hand, playing the part of good global citizen with its cooperation on climate change, while simultaneously fraying nerves in the region because of its aggressive, unlawful territorial grab in the South China Sea. Doug, wet and warm weather greeted the president as he made his way here to Laos. Not only the first sitting U.S. president to come here to the country, but also the first to directly address the people of Laos. That will happen, and he'll talk not just about the need for improved economic ties, but also about unexploded ordnance, which has been a real problem and a vestige of the Vietnam War. It's been happening all over the country. He'll talk about that during his time here at ASEAN as well. Doug?
Kevin Corrick traveling with the president in Laos tonight. Thank you, Kevin. North Korea made a splash of its own during the Asian summit. The communist regime fired 3 more missiles into the ocean near Japan in its latest display of petulance. Correspondent Benjamin Hall has that story.
Young dictator Kim Jong-un is at it again. Today, the North Korean leader successfully test-fired 3 medium-range Rodong ballistic missiles, sending them 620 miles towards Japan, where they landed less than 200 miles off the coast. About 660 miles in the other direction, President Obama was meeting world leaders at the G20 summit in Hangzhou, China, meaning the summit could have been within range. The rogue country has now carried out 10 such tests this year alone and are in violation of countless UN Security Council resolutions that ban all ballistic-related experiments in the country. At a press conference today, the Japanese Prime Minister responded.
It is an intolerable and reckless act of jeopardizing the peace and stability of the region. It is strongly condemned and is unforgivable.
North Korea's missile program has shown vast signs of improvement this year. Just 2 weeks ago, they again successfully launched a second missile from a submarine, which flew over 300 miles, the longest distance they've achieved with such a weapon. Submarine launchers are far harder to detect and mean they can be launched far closer to their targets. Despite all this, China, long said to be the only country with influence over the North, are still standing by the country, while urging a peaceful resolution.
China's stance on the relevant issue is consistent and clear. We hope all relevant parties can avoid taking actions that may escalate tensions and can make joint efforts to maintain peace and stability on the peninsula.
The UN Security Council will discuss these latest violations in a closed-door meeting on Tuesday morning, as requested by the US and Japan. Only then will we know what action, if any, they'll take. Doug?
Benjamin Hall in London tonight. Thank you, Benjamin. Twin bombings near the Afghan Defense Ministry have killed at least 24 people in Kabul. The Taliban is claiming responsibility. A public health official says another 91 people were hurt. ISIS terrorists launched a series of suicide bombings and other attacks across Syria today, and when it was over, at least 48 people were dead. The wave of attacks included 6 suicide bombings and 1 remotely controlled explosion. ISIS targeted government-held areas and Kurdish forces too. This is a Fox News alert, the latest on a manhunt going on right now in Las Vegas, Nevada. The story began with an unusual escape. Correspondent Will Carr is following the situation tonight from our West Coast newsroom. Hello, Will.
Good evening, Doug. Authorities are trying to track down this murder suspect who they say is armed and dangerous tonight, and it comes as the North Las Vegas Police Department is facing some tough questions about how he got there to begin with. The suspect is Alonzo Perez. He was arrested Friday morning and taken to a detective bureau for questioning. Perez was placed into a locked interview room in handcuffs and then evidently left alone. Members of the police department tell us Perez twisted his metal handcuffs until they broke. That's a quote. We asked how that's possible. They say it's under investigation and won't elaborate. Perez then somehow broke out of the locked room and got out of the building without being seen, and police say he then stole a nearby F-250 and took off.
We just had a truck jacked, and they said, "Oh, well, we just lost a suspect." And we thought, "You lost a suspect?"
The police department tells us that when Perez is back behind bars, they plan to investigate exactly how he was able to escape in the first place and what needs to be done to make sure this never happens again.
This is not something that happens hardly ever. I mean, at least in the time that I've been here, I don't ever recall an incident like this happening.
Perez was initially arrested in connection to the shooting death of Muhammad Robinson outside of a McDonald's in North Las Vegas. Robinson's family says they're terrified that he could hurt somebody else, and they want him back in custody immediately. He will still face charges for that, as well as new charges for both the escape and for stealing the truck. Doug.
All right, Will, keep us posted should anything change. Thank you. Coming up next, free trade. What does it mean for you? But first, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 5 in New York City, with city beaches closed to swimming on Labor Day. The coastlines of New York City, New Jersey, and Long Island were under a tropical storm warning for the remnants of Hermine. Visitors were allowed onto the beach, but told to stay out of the water. Fox 25 in Oklahoma City with damage assessments from a magnitude 5.6 earthquake just south of the Kansas state line. Emergency officials are finding only minor to moderate damage. The state transportation department says roads and bridges are all safe. Utilities, pipelines, and fuel infrastructure are also said to be unharmed. And this is a live look at Los Angeles from Fox 11. The big story there tonight is a bankruptcy filing for one of the world's largest shipping companies. It throws ports and retailers around the world into confusion. South Korea-based Hanjun represents nearly 8% of the trans-Pacific trade volume for the U.S. Ships from China to Canada are being refused permission to offload or take aboard containers, and this could have a major impact on fall fashions and holiday shopping. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.
Thousands of spectators.
President Obama is defending his support of a Pacific trade deal that is opposed by both of the people aiming to succeed him. Tonight on this Labor Day, correspondent Rich Edson looks at what free trade really means for American workers.
Free trade. One Democrat continues selling it.
Nobody's able to describe to me how this would not be a significant improvement for U.S. workers and U.S. businesses going forward.
Another opposes that deal.
I am not in favor of what I have learned about it.
At issue, the pending 12-nation free trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In 2012, Hillary Clinton called the yet-negotiated pact the gold standard in open, free, transparent, fair trade. She's since joined the recent political wave in opposition. Republican nominee Donald Trump is also against it. The North American Free Trade Agreement took effect in 1994. Early next decade, the U.S. normalized trade relations with China. In 1990, the U.S. economy had more than 12.5 million manufacturing jobs. In 2005, about 10 million. Now, roughly 8.5 million. In the past 25 years, average hourly earnings in manufacturing have barely risen. $19.40 in 1990, less than $21 today. Factoring inflation, that's a severe pay cut. Free trade supporters blame factors beyond these agreements.
If you look at the loss of manufacturing jobs in this country, which is substantial, 80 to 90% of that is because of the very rapid improvement in technology.
Free trade advocates also say the U.S. benefits from these deals because they lower tariffs in competing nations and reduce costs for American shoppers and manufacturers. And Trump's economic advisor denied the Republican nominee is fully rejecting free trade.
I happen to think trade is good, but I also think some of these trade deals need to be renegotiated to take into account the interests of American workers.
Even if the U.S. can negotiate more favorable trade agreements or reject joining them, U.S. manufacturing workers still face the forces of globalization and continued advances in technology. Doug?
Rich Edson. Thank you, Rich. Labor Day weekend marks the unofficial end of the summer travel season. Airlines traditionally reduce prices to get people on the planes in the fall. Airlines are at the same time dealing with enormous pressure to get their technological houses in order after a brutal summer. Correspondent Bob Schmidt has the story tonight from Philadelphia.
It's hell. It really is hell.
Like many passengers, Paul Purell has found himself stranded at an airport, helpless, a nightmare. This summer, we saw two examples of just how bad this can get when Delta and Southwest nearly collapsed after outages paralyzed airline computers. In each case, nearly 1,000 flights grounded, passengers stuck in terminals, no answers, the delays lingered for days. In 2015, for the second time in 13 years, airlines themselves were to blame for more flight delays than weather and air traffic issues. More than 323,000 flights that should have taken off on time.
It's time for the airlines to update their IT systems for the jet age.
Democratic Senators Edward Markey and Richard Blumenthal, both members of the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, sent a letter to 13 different airlines, including Delta and Southwest, suggesting changes and asking about plans to avoid these blunders in the future.
Airlines should use their record profits to invest in new technology and implement transparent and fair policies that protect and compensate the customer.
Trade group Airlines for America says those profits are being used, saying carriers are investing $1.5 billion per month into products and technologies to make flying better.
You've got to make sure that your production systems are robust, so you're building them to be as fault tolerant as possible. So if you've got failures in those systems, you've got other systems that can take over.
Joseph George works with airlines on technology.
Why is it that a computer meltdown can cause an entire operation to shut down when really you just need planes and pilots to fly planes?
We've evolved to the point that technology is fundamentally the backbone of how businesses run their operations. So it's to the point that when the systems that rely on those technologies, when those systems fail, the business cannot run anymore.
Passengers want changes now.
They need to come up with a backup plan or something.
Senators Blumenthal and Markey have given the airlines until September 16th to respond, and based on the feedback they receive, we could see legislation to ensure that passengers aren't grounded by any future meltdowns. In Philadelphia, Rob Schmidt, Fox News.
Labor Day is a great day to set up the rest of the fall campaign. Tonight we look at some of the key races that could determine what Congress looks like in the year 2017. Here's correspondent Kristen Fisher.
For Democrats to retake control of the Senate this November, they need to pick up 5 seats. It's a tall order, but possible. Some Republican strategists think a candidate like Donald Trump at the top of the ticket isn't making things easier. Instead, they think Senate candidates from Arizona to Florida and these 13 battleground states are nervous.
On the scale of 1 to 10, they're probably at a 15.
Establishment heavyweight Senators Marco Rubio and John McCain both just won their primary battles in Florida and Arizona, respectively. Now they're facing stiff general election fights. Democrats believe their best chance to flip a seat may be in New Hampshire or Pennsylvania. Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania is proving to be particularly vulnerable to his Democratic challenger, Katie McGinty, while in New Hampshire, the popular Republican incumbent, Kelly Ayotte, is facing a serious threat from the equally popular sitting governor, Maggie Hassan.
I think New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, those are two very likely pickups. You have a very strong, not only a strong woman at the top of the ticket with Hillary Clinton, but also now Katie McGinty.
The odds of Democrats retaking control of the House are greater. They would need to pick up an additional 30 seats this November. One possibility may be the seat currently held by Florida Congressman Carlos Curbelo, a freshman Republican who represents a district that's 2/3 Hispanic. He is an outspoken critic of Donald Trump, but still, Curbelo's facing what many Republicans in predominantly Hispanic districts are now dubbing the Trump effect, a down-ballot display of disdain for the Republican at the top of the ticket. And so is freshman Congressman Will Hurd in Texas. He's seeking re-election from a constituency that's nearly 70% Hispanic.
Donald Trump's position on immigration and illegal immigration, both, are very damaging and very difficult for Republicans to navigate if they represent minority-heavy districts.
In the end, it may all come down to turnout and whether or not Trump and Clinton, two candidates with record high unfavorability ratings, will be able to get voters to the polls this November. Doug?
Kristen Fisher. Thank you, Kristen. Let's look now more closely at one of the most competitive and costly Senate races this fall. That's in Pennsylvania. It is a key in the battle for control of the Senate. The latest Real Clear Politics average has Democratic challenger Katie McGinty in a virtual tie with Republican incumbent Pat Toomey. We get more on that race tonight from senior correspondent Rick Leventhal.
Everything's at stake. The White House, the Supreme Court, control of the Senate, maybe even control of the House.
Pennsylvania Republican Pat Toomey, a freshman U.S. Senator, battling to keep his seat in one of the tightest races in the nation against Democratic challenger Katie McGinty.
Will you help me send Pat Toomey packing?
McGinty, once an aide to former President Bill Clinton, is firmly backing Secretary Hillary Clinton in the run to Washington. But Toomey has refused to endorse Donald Trump.
There are things Donald Trump has said and done that give me great pause, and I have significant concerns about. So I remain in a mode of waiting to be persuaded.
Toomey and McGinty both flooding the airways with ads in what is now the most expensive Senate race in America, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, with $59 million spent and 2 months left until Election Day.
Katie McGinty, 4 background checks, 4 banning assault weapons.
The gun control attack is especially interesting considering Toomey put his NRA endorsement at risk with 2 key votes on the Senate floor.
Toomey crossed party lines twice.
Toomey has backing from gun control activists, including Michael Bloomberg, who paid for this ad, but McGinty isn't buying it.
All of these dark money special interests that Pat Toomey has spent a lot of time going to bat for as a congressman, as a senator, as a Wall Street insider, as a Washington insider, and boy, are they pouring money in here.
My opponent, Katie McGinty, it would be a rubber stamp for Hillary Clinton or a complete obstacle to a President Trump, should he win. And she would want to continue all these failed policies. That's not good for Pennsylvania.
Political observers say presidential politics are influencing the Pennsylvania contest, but Toomey can still run a parallel campaign.
If Senator Toomey has made it this far without either rejecting or endorsing Mr. Trump, I think he probably can make it all the way to Election Day.
Trump's rebound in national polls could help Toomey here in Pennsylvania, but he still has a decided disadvantage among registered voters. Roughly 4.1 million Democrats versus 3.2 million Republicans. And turnout will likely be higher because this, of course, is a presidential election year. In Philadelphia, Rick Leventhal, Fox News.
Europe's Philae lander is no longer lost in space. Philae landed on a comet 2 years ago and has been largely silent since its battery ran out of power. But now it's been spotted by its mothership, the European Space Agency's Rosetta probe, which launched the lander. Rosetta's camera shows the lander is wedged in a dark crack of the comet. Well, Labor Day is the traditional start of the fall campaign season, as we've been telling you. We're going to check in on the presidential candidates when the panel joins me after a quick break.
I have asthma, one of many pieces in my life. So when my asthma symptoms kept coming back on my long-term control medicine, I talked to my doctor and found a missing piece in my asthma treatment with Brio.
Once daily Brio prevents asthma symptoms. Brio's for adults with asthma not well controlled on a long-term asthma control medicine, like an inhaled corticosteroid. Brio won't replace a rescue inhaler for sudden breathing problems. Brio opens up airways to help improve breathing for a full 24 hours. Brio contains a type of medicine that increases the risk of death from asthma problems and may increase the risk of hospitalization in children controlled on a long-term asthma control medicine, like an inhaled.
I went into the State Department understanding classification. I'd been on the Senate Armed Services Committee for years before I was Secretary of State. I take classification seriously. The fact I couldn't remember certain meetings, whether or not they had occurred, doesn't in any way affect the commitment that I had and still have to the treatment of classified material.
Well, until just a couple of hours ago, it had been 275 days since Hillary Clinton held a formal press conference. That changed with the arrival of her new campaign plane, upon which reporters and the embedded producers who follow her and who have been following her for the better part of 2 years now have joined her on the plane, and she came back to their rear section of the fuselage to engage in a little to and fro and answered some substantive questions, one of which was about classification, as you just heard. She said that she was intimately familiar with the whole process, having been a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Let's bring in our panel now. Tucker Carlson, host of Fox and Friends Weekend. Charles Lane, opinion writer for The Washington Post. And syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. That answer raises a lot of interesting questions, Charles.
Well, I mean, she doesn't have a good answer. There's no way you can be Secretary of State, and as she said, having served years on the Armed Services Committee, and not know what the C means, and as an annotation indicating classification or confidentiality. So she simply repeats it. She goes on to the next question. I guess this now qualifies as having held a press conference. I don't see how it makes any difference one way or the other about how available she is or whether or not she's answered. So she's had one. I think it helped to do it on a plane because then we can't hear the question very well. All we hear is her answer. I think it suits her. Nothing has changed.
Chuck, we knew from this FBI release on Friday that there were that letter C was on many of the emails that she had received and or sent. Here she's admitting that she knew what it was. Raises further doubts.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with Charles to the extent there's kind of no brilliant
one-liner she can come up with to make this all go away. It is what it is from her point of view at this point. But I guess what I took away from this is once again, how lucky she is to be running against the person she's running against. Let's assume that Hillary Clinton went through the Armed Services Committee and Secretary of State and didn't know what a C meant when it was in the margin of an email. Does anybody really believe Donald Trump knows what the C means in the margin of a classified email? That's the choice voters are posed with here. It's not just a referendum on Hillary Clinton in the abstract, up or down, and she's quite unpopular, let's face it, but it's the alternative, Donald Trump. And that's why I think ultimately, even though this is sort of a constant irritant to her candidacy, it hasn't brought her down because of the guy she's running against.
Tucker?
If only. It has brought her down, and I didn't think it would, actually. I thought this was baked in the cake, that people sort of knew who they were voting for. You're not voting for Hillary if you want openness and honesty, obviously. You're voting for if you don't want Trump and you want competence and someone who's been around a while. Look at the numbers. They're unbelievable. And I think that's what precipitated this press event, whatever it was, on the plane. Smart of her to do that, by the way, and good for her. But, boy, the trend lines are in the wrong direction for Hillary Clinton, not just nationally, and I agree, those are not predictive, those polls, but in states like Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida. If those trends keep up, it's bad for her, and I think the only thing that you can attribute her downward slide to is this spate of stories about her email. I think it actually has hurt her, and I didn't think it would.
And may explain why she had a press conference.
Well, I think this is normally, it's a post-convention bump that was very strong, almost artificially strong, kind of settling back to normal. She's still up 5 in the national poll.
Whatever you attribute it to is clearly a settling back. It's clearly a retreat. She's clearly going down in the polls. And it's not that people have doubts that she's going to understand what's in the memo she gets. The issue is that she tells fibs, big ones, and ones that are undeniable, of which there is no escape. So I think it has to do again and again with honesty. But even more important, I think, is the fact that nothing can escape. It's like a black hole. Nothing can escape the bubble of the emails and the honesty issue. Can you cite one policy issue on which people have even noted it's all overwhelmed and smothered by the news on the emails? That's her problem. She can't escape the emails, and it's hard to see what exactly springs her out of the black hole.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you talk to lots of Democrats privately, and their frustration is that against this opponent, she shouldn't be up just 5. She should be up 15. And yes, so obviously she's weighed down by this. I still think the space is large enough to carry her through.
Another thing that she addressed or was asked about at this spontaneous press conference aboard her plane today was Russia's increasing propensity to aggressively cyber attack into our electoral system, intruding not only the DNC email system, but also apparently into our electoral system. Here's what she had to say about that.
The fact that our intelligence services are now viewing Russian activity as a potential threat against our electoral system raises further questions about Trump, and I think those are questions the American people should be asking and answering.
She's alluding to the fact that Trump at one point said that he liked the idea that Russia was intruding into our electoral system, but not for the purpose that she's alluding to there, Charles.
Well, it was kind of an offhanded and rather bizarre comment. You don't want to be telling the leader of an adversary, our leading adversary in the world right now, that it should be intruding into our system, reading our emails, breaking in, essentially, as she said, the way Watergate did into the secrets of the party, and then releasing them to the world. It's not a good idea. And I think the fact that Trump has spoken kindly, not just of Putin, but of the butchers of Tiananmen Square. Saddam Hussein is a great hero in the fight against terrorism, and all this is rather odd and disturbing. So I think it's a good tack for her to take. Let's see if it can escape the email scandal.
But I think Trump's comments were based upon he wanted the Russians to find out more about what Hillary was up to.
Well, I mean, take 3 steps back. Her forebears, her ancestors on the left must be rolling over in their graves to see her red baiting. It's the Russians. It's to be afraid of the Russians. Is there a single, I mean, how many people outside Washington look at the world and say in 20 years, our greatest adversary will be Russia and not China? I don't think very many people. I mean, you know, who knows what will actually happen? I just don't think it's a sellable product, actually, the idea that Trump is controlled by Putin and you ought to, you know, be really afraid. He's no more controlled by Putin than she is by China. Which is the greater threat? I mean, let's be real.
Well, it's not red baiting if Russia is not communist, and it's not communist. It's a different kind of dictatorship.
There was a tongue-in-cheek element here, but but be afraid of Russia, I guess. I just don't think many people are.
I think there are more people who are than you.
Here there are.
Yeah.
You don't think Russia has malevolent intent?
Yes.
The one thing that explains just about everything in its foreign policy is a desire to diminish and injure the United States. It connects the actions in Ukraine, it connects the actions in the Balkans, it connects the actions in Syria, connects everything it does, and it is succeeding. It is the biggest threat right now. If China emerges as a larger one in 20 years, I think we worry about that about 10 years down the road. Right now, it is Russia.
But the missing element, I mean, there are many people who wish us harm. The missing element is economic power, it seems to me. I mean, North Korea would like to eliminate us. They can't. They're poor. And Russia is a poor country. I mean, I think Putin's evil. I'm certainly not defending Putin or their intentions. I'm merely saying hard to see anything good on it.
A North Korean submarine within 300 miles of Los Angeles can launch a nuclear missile in time, whether it's rich or poor. That doesn't have any effect on the threat. So I don't see why we have to constrain ourselves to worrying about being overshadowed economically. There are a lot of other ways to overshadow and to harm us.
On that note, next up, a rough weekend for President Obama's foreign policy.
Look, we're moving into a new era here where a number of countries have significant capacities. And frankly, we got more capacity than anybody, both offensively and defensively. But our goal is not to suddenly, in the cyber arena, duplicate a cycle of escalation that we saw when it comes to other arms races in the past, but rather to start instituting some norms so that everybody's acting responsibly.
Well, following revelations that Russia was involved or is behind a string of cyber intrusions in the U.S., it is no surprise that this handshake between President Putin and President Obama looked a little bit on the steely side. I mean, if looks could kill. But that's only one aspect of a deteriorating relationship between our two countries. And in a larger picture of some problems with the G20 summit. We're back with the panel now. There were a lot of indignities in this trip to Asia, one of which when Air Force One pulled up to the airport in the Chinese city, whose name escapes me right now, they didn't have the mobile staircase for the president. I couldn't believe that. He had to open the belly stairwell and come out that way. It might be what college students call a microaggression, but a telling one nonetheless.
This is a macroaggression. The Chinese are the most adept people at diplomacy and ritual and protocol of any on the planet. They've been doing it for 3,000 years. And to explain this as an accident is ridiculous. It shows their utter contempt for the United States and for this president. And when you heard what he said about cyber wars, you really want to weep. He's been in office for 8 years, and he essentially says, well, look, we have the advantage in cyber technology, but we don't want to press it in any way. We want the other guys to live by these norms. The idea that Russia and China live by norms, that somehow Obama is going to educate them into these norms. Russia is helping to commit genocide in Syria, and you expect that it's going to acquire etiquette on cyber? It is simply, it's astonishing that we could have a president who believes this, and it explains why, after 8 years, the great powers of the world, starting with China and Russia, know that they are dealing with an adversary, the United States, its president, who is simply one who does not earn any of their respect.
And Chuck, there was another indignity, pretty gross, really, on the scale of international diplomacy, when the president of the Philippines called President Obama, and I know this is inappropriate dinner time conversation, called him the son of a whore for for threatening, I should say, to intervene in their human rights record, to observe some frailties in that.
That is a puzzling one. This new president of the Philippines, to cut a long story short, has an extraordinary policy of essentially extrajudicial killings of suspected drug dealers in this country. And I don't think the United States can sit by and allow a longstanding ally who we fund to just conduct itself that way. On the other hand, we do need the Philippines, and we do have an alliance with them. And this guy decided to just push back against our president on that basis. I would say that what struck me about that, though, is that there are a lot of other dictators in Asia that the president is willing to kind of do business with. They're a little less flamboyant than this elected authoritarian in the Philippines, but, you know, Xi Jinping of China, he visited Laos, which is not a free country. He's been to Vietnam and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, I think that's part of this sort of big dilemma of U.S. policy in Asia, is that a lot of our friends are not particularly exemplary Democrats either. And that case with this guy from the Philippines just exemplified that.
Tucker, the other indignity, North Korea launching 3 mid-range missiles, which landed 600 miles away from the G20 summit.
That's true. Let me just say something about the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines over the last 70 years has been one of those consistent U.S. allies. Surveys of foreign populations show they like us almost more than anybody else, the Poles, but since we liberated Manila in 1945, the Obama administration hassling them over their policy toward drug dealers. The Saudis, one of our closest allies, behead people for adultery and having a martini, and we don't say anything. I mean, so let's put some perspective here. This is part of a longer-term reflex of this president to stick it in the eye of our friends and kowtow to our enemies. There's no reason, especially since what's really at stake here is alignment. I mean, the Philippines could actually align to some extent with China. You don't want that. That would be a total disaster, a generational disaster, over executing drug dealers, really?
Well, I think it is a little bit bigger deal than that. He's basically unleashed thugs.
He's a bad guy.
He's written a blank check to people who go out and murder anybody.
Yeah, no, it's bad. Lots of bad things happen. But the question is, what's in our interest? It's a terrible thing. I'm appalled. But what's in our interest? That's the question.
Yeah, well, I think that's it's a harder question than you're making it seem.
Teetotaling adultery. I think that's the way to
It raises the question, though, in advance of the presidential election, whether we can expect more aggressive maneuvers by our adversaries in the coming months, of the waning months of the Obama administration.
I think these waning months are dangerous months. It isn't often that you're a Putin or you're Chinese leadership and you draw an adversary as weak as Obama, who obviously does not want to stir the pot anywhere. He doesn't want to lift a finger in Syria, in Iraq, elsewhere, and he's sort of struggling to hold the Europeans just onto the minimal sanctions for Ukraine. If you are the Chinese, and you've seen how Obama has flinched time after time as with the land grab, the illegal creation of islands and airfields by the Chinese in the South China Sea, why wouldn't you push ahead with it right now? Here's your golden opportunity.
That's it for the panel tonight, but stay tuned for one little guy who just needed a little bit of help. Finally tonight, there are times when we all need a little help, and the same is true in the animal kingdom.
Come on. Just stay there for a second.
That is a frightened seal who decided to take the man's advice and hid out by hopping up onto the boat to escape the pod of orcas who are on the hunt. They are called killer whales for a reason. The seal then tests the water only to retreat right back into the boat moments later. That pod of orcas still there. He settled in for a safe ride for a little bit as one smart and safe seal. I think there's a political metaphor in that, the devil you don't know, which he opted for, versus the one we do know. That's it for Special Report tonight. I'm Doug McElroy. Good night from Washington. On the Record. Coming up next.